So, yeah, before we get to this, because, all right, so they dumped him in the river, left him underwater for at least a week, 2 weeks. Family requested the body. Local sheriff got the body out of the water and buried it in Mississippi without involving the family. So the governor of Illinois requested of the governor of Mississippi to give the body back. Mamie Till got death threats for asking that her son be buried in Chicago, exhumed and buried in Chicago. Then, so when they get the body back to Chicago, and she's going to the funeral home, she's telling the story about how she can smell the body 2 blocks away. And when she finally sees the body, I mean, she's like, okay, it's, been underwater for a couple of weeks. He got beat up. He got shot in the head. All that's visible. So what she decided to do after, the death threats of getting the body back, et cetera, she decided to, now by this time, this is international news. All the stuff that's gone on. So, this is what the body looks like at the funeral. She decided to have an open casket funeral to show what they did. And again, international press. So this was going to be the flashpoint for the civil rights movement, because this happened before the Montgomery bus boycott. You don't have a better poster child for the evils of racism and segregation than this. Because usually what happened to him, they never get the body back. And it was fairly common for stuff like this to happen. So Mamie Till spoke out about her son's death. She held an open casket funeral for her son so the world could see what they did to my boy. His face was battered beyond recognition. He had a bullet hole in his head. Body decomposed after spending several days underwater. So coming 3 months before the Montgomery bus boycott, Till's murder, while commonplace as an event, is thought to be one of the galvanizing events of the modern civil rights movement. While Rosa Parks, which happened later, was seen as more palatable, Till's murder exposed Southern lynching to the world. Actually went to trial, which is unusual. Even though the defense attorney said, defending the guys, every last Anglo-Saxon one of you has the courage to free these men, and eventually he went on to defend the civil rights of the black community. They were acquitted. The murderers admitted doing it and were acquitted by an all-white jury. And Mrs. Bryant she's still alive and unrepentant to this day. So, this was the story told to me at 7. To explain, look, no, you don't have to worry about all white people, but there are some white people you have to worry about.
What happened to you?
Didn't I tell the story here?
This one thing,
This
no,
turn.
I just,
I'm not here. His last turn.
Okay. Can I use you as a prop?
sure.
Just because you're closer. You ever been to Disneyland? Alice in Wonderland teacups.
Yes.
I'm 7. I'm waiting. It's 1962. You could smoke in the park then. So I'm standing in line with my Uncle Winston. I'm, waiting to get on these teacups, right? And there's this white dude, older white man with a kid. I look at the kid, smile, he smiles back, look up at whoever he's with, and he's like smoking a cigarette and he's mad. Okay, whatever, right? I'm 7. Whatever, the kid's cool. So I'm wearing a hoodie. At some point, he dropped his live cigarette in my hoodie and walked away. Perhaps I look like his favorite ashtray. Not sure. Anyway, the hoodie started smoldering. Uncle stripped it off, put it out. But looked around for the guy, I couldn't find him, naturally, right? And we just kind of went on our business, and then, told my parents about that, when we got home. Because at this point, there was no I-5, so you had to drive, surface streets to get to Disneyland anyway, from South Central to Anaheim, which, and on the way you would pass places where the Congress of Racial Equality was like picketing segregated neighborhoods and saying Jim Crow must go, and I'm going to my parents, who is this Jim Crow guy and how come they don't like him? Right? I'm 7, right? It's Romper Room. It's, not that you know what that is. This is before Sesame Street. A kid's show, right? Ranger Rick, Sheriff John, Bozo the Clown. It's, the 60s. We're innocent, right? So they told me about Emmett Till, like, wait, you mean there are white people that don't like me? Like, what about, Mrs. Eastwood, Miss Twire next door, who, the old ladies who still lived in the neighborhood next door, give us, Christmas baskets and Easter bunny stuff. No, they're cool. What about the kids that we play at school? No, they're cool. Well, how do I tell which white people don't like me or not? What, Southern accents? Yeah, like that, right? So Emmett Till was told to me about that. And so people will say, well, that's child abuse. No, that's just being real. What could happen? See, what happened to Emmett, because the rules of Chicago, race relations in Chicago, are different than Money, Mississippi in 1955. LA still had parts that was segregated, even in the 60s. I mean, there were still white people in my neighborhood in South Central, but, when we moved across La Cienega to Culver City, we were the first black people in that part of Culver City. And the Jews had been there before, so you can see, different levels of segregation, right? So, cautionary tale. So, to this day, in line, I keep an arm's distance, even though, people, what's your personal space? I keep an arm's distance. I do look people in the eye, right? But different, right? So, Montgomery bus boycott. How many of you rode the bus to get here? Okay. So, imagine that in order to ride the bus, you pay in the front door, get off, and get on in the back. If there are empty seats in front, you can't sit in them. If the white seats are full, a white person can order you out of your seat in the black section, and you have to give it up or be subject to arrest. Try pulling that with LTD today. The bus driver can call you nigger, ape, black cow, and worse. So, before Rosa Parks, high school student Claudette Colvin resisted in the spring and was arrested in the spring. Exact same issue. Wouldn't give her seat up to a white person. Black teenage, single mom. So here's one of the things that one can take issue with. I can understand Rosa Parks, lighter skin than Claudette Colvin, married, secretary, NAACP secretary, being used to illustrate the bus issue. But she was not the first black person to not give up her seat. Claudette Colvin was. Okay, but she's dark-skinned, single mom, high school student. people decide to pick and choose who's a better representative of civil rights if they're going to be palatable. I'm not saying that's right. I'm just saying, just notice that tactic if you decide that you're going to engage in the civil rights struggle. Are you acceptable? Are you a good poster child? Poster childs are shibboleth. Are you a good poster child for that? Okay? So she was arrested, basically protested or resisted in the spring and was arrested in the spring. Local NAACP secretary Rosa Parks became the figurehead when she refused in December. So it's actually planned as a battle tactic. Parks was lighter than Colvin, and as NAACP secretary, more strategic symbol, so that then you can bring in, their legal department and all that. The WPC, that is the Women's Political Council, the phone tree mobilized for a community meeting and one-day bus boycott to protest Rosa Parks' arrest and trial. That spawned what's called the Montgomery Improvement Association. The issue began to expand beyond just simply buses. Remember, this is going to be a one-day bus boycott that expanded into over a year, right? Because no one was really certain how successful a boycott would be or what retaliation would take place. So the Montgomery Improvement Association was looking for a quote-unquote more humane form of segregation. That is, whites have front to the middle, blacks have middle to back, no need to give up seats. Well, that seemed like, rational and reasonable at the time. You may frown, and we wouldn't accept that today. But, yeah.
I wanted to say, like, at this time during like the 50s, even in Africa, like the country that I come from, we got independence only in 1980.
Right.
So the same kind of stuff, maybe in a different, but within Africa it was happening, where we were being sent to the villages and the towns. You couldn't walk in the town. In 1979, my father told me he couldn't walk in the city in Africa.
Yeah, right.
So, like, where do we go?
Which country?
I come from Zimbabwe.
Ah, okay. Right. Right. So definitely fighting to get rid of Rhodesia and create Zimbabwe. Right. Yes. Under Rhodesia. Right. It would be segregated then because of, apartheid. They didn't call it that.
Yeah.
But that's basically the same model of South Africa under colonialism. So back in Montgomery. So, kinder, gentler, more humane form of segregation. This certainly led to some criticisms, by people like Malcolm X, basically saying, look, why settle for crumbs off the table? Have your own bakery. Why argue about sitting in the front or the back? Own the bus line. But, okay, more humane form of segregation, right? Hire black drivers in black neighborhoods. Okay, so those were so Montgomery Improvement Association called to maintain the boycott, which remember was originally planned for one day, just to show what the economic impact was, which was significant. Called maintain the boycott until those changes were made. More humane form of segregation, hire black drivers in black neighborhoods. The answer, eventually of course, was no, but King wondered, how could I make a speech that would be militant enough to keep my people aroused to positive action, and yet moderate enough to keep this further within controllable and Christian bounds, i.e., nonviolent. Okay, as to arouse the people, but keep it within decent bounds. Right? Because even then they're talking about, all right, we're being militant because we're being, you know, so-called uppity, but not inside a riot. So, MIA, Montgomery Improvement Association, organized carpools, taxis, drivers, money for gas, and maintenance on vehicles. Vehicles could be subject to police harassment, a few other things like that. So the resistance basically get tough. Law enforcement harassment of carpools and cabs. Martin Luther King was arrested for speeding, I think a mile an hour over the speed limit. The White Citizens Council, which was a kinder, gentler Klan. Actually, there's a White Citizens Council in Veneta today. The King home was dynamited. Well, Coretta and baby Yolanda were at home. Yolanda's dead now, but there was 11,000 white people at a White Citizens Council rally in downtown Montgomery. And there was white assistance to counter the resistance. Predominantly white, but not all white. Pacifist groups like the Fellowship of Reconciliation, which is Quakers. American Friends Service Committee, also Quakers. Howard and Sue Thurman, Benjamin Mays, Mordecai Johnson, Bayard Rustin. Bayard was a radical Quaker, peace activist, and gay man. Rustin in particular introduced Montgomery Improvement Association and King to Howard Thurman and Henry Emerson Fosdick's writings on nonviolence and helped with training workshops on nonviolent action. Rustin also helped King prepare articles for publication in religious journals. So when I use the Star Wars analogy to talk about, okay, if you consider Martin Luther King like Obi-Wan Kenobi, then Howard Thurman is Yoda. Now nobody knows about Yoda because he's the secret teacher. But Yoda's teacher, that is Howard Thurman's teacher, was Gandhi. Now, Thurman actually met Gandhi, went to India to meet Gandhi. And so the connection between, so it was Bayard Rustin that actually made the connection from Martin Luther King to Howard Thurman, and that's where the whole Gandhi thing, nonviolent thing came in. Because after the house got dynamited, Martin was sitting up, and he, hate to use this shibboleth, but any red-blooded black man whose house with wife and child gets bombed, what's he gonna do in America? In Southern America, what you gonna do? You gonna defend your house? Right, okay, so Martin's sitting up with a shotgun and a pistol at his kitchen table, waiting for the next folks to come. Right, wouldn't you? Sure. Okay? Bayard is basically saying, sitting at the table, look, I'm waiting for them too with you. But if you respond with guns, they're going to wipe you out. And your movement will be wiped out with you. You have to have a nonviolent approach. Here's how you do it. Let me introduce you to my friend Howard. And here's why you do that. So that's where the connection to Gandhi and nonviolence, that's where it came from Martin Luther King, by means of a black, gay Quaker, who even when Martin Luther King goes to Watts after the riots, who's standing next to him? Bayard Rustin, not Jesse Jackson. Don't even get me started on Jesse Jackson. All right, Little Rock 9. So remember the Supreme Court said all deliberate speed, and you interpret that in English as meaning like now, quick, all right? So September 23rd, 1957, no ordinary school day for Elizabeth Eckbert and 8 other African-American teenagers in Little Rock, Arkansas. Little Rock Central High School, like many schools across this country was segregated, Little Rock 9 would be the first African Americans to go to school at Little Rock Central High School. That morning, Arkansas National Guardsmen had turned the 9 away, along with police, stood by while a mob pelted the students' cars with stones, assaulted them, and threatened their lives. Now, remember, this is the Supreme Court ordering desegregation. That's federal. All governors have military command of the National Guard. The feds, to back this up, say, okay, you got your National Guard, we got the Army. So we're ordering the Army to guard 9 black kids going to high school. So basically, that's just so you know, that's the Little Rock 9. So eventually, they didn't need the troops anymore. But see, I think we talked about this, right? Eugene's Civil Rights Movement. All right. I hope you will forever refer to the actual speech on the second March on Washington, which you think is the first, but the first was organized during the war to protest war industries, and it didn't happen as an event, but everybody was in town for it. Roosevelt signed the executive order into law, so they canceled the march. The second March on Washington, which you know as the first March on Washington, was organized around civil rights issues that were still going on and organized by the same folks, including Bayard Rustin and A. Philip Randolph, who organized the first one, but was elderly, so the field work and the footwork was done by Bayard Rustin. Right? So Martin wrote a speech, and he referred to it as the bounce check speech. And if you look at the text of the speech, you'll see why. So go to slide if you would. In a sense, we have come to our nation's capital to cash a check. When the architects of our republic wrote the magnificent words of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, they were signing a promissory note to which every American was to fall heir. This note was a promise that all men would be guaranteed the inalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It's obvious today that America has defaulted on this promissory note insofar as her citizens of color are concerned. Instead of honoring this sacred obligation, America has given the Negro people a bad check which has come back marked insufficient funds. I don't know how many of you have checking accounts or have had a bad check written against you, but when a check bounces, what do you want?
I want your money.
You want your money. And when do you want it? Now. Right? Bounce check speech. The check bounced, America. But we refuse to believe that the Bank of Justice is bankrupt. We refuse to believe that there are insufficient funds in the great vaults of opportunity of this nation. So we've come to cash this check, a check that will give us upon demand the riches of freedom and the security of justice. We've also come to this hallowed spot to remind America of the first fierce urgency of now. This is no time to engage in the luxury of cooling off or to take the tranquilizing drug of gradualism. Gradualism is this. Change comes slowly. Be patient. Be patient and you'll get what you want. Don't be militant. Speak in reasonable tones. Now is the time to rise from the dark and desolate valley of segregation to the sunlit path of racial justice. Now is the time to open the doors of opportunity to all of God's children. Now is the time to lift our nation from the quicksands of racial injustice to the solid rock of brotherhood. It would be fatal for the nation to overlook the urgency of the moment and to underestimate the determination of the Negro. This sweltering summer of the Negro's legitimate discontent will not pass until there is an invigorating autumn of freedom and equality. 1963 is not an end, but a beginning. Those who hope that the Negro needed to blow off steam and will now be content will have a rude awakening if the nation returns to business as usual. There will be neither rest nor tranquility in America until the Negro is granted his citizenship rights. The whirlwinds of revolt will continue to shake the foundations of our nation until the bright day of justice emerges. And it's at that point where, if you read the speech, he launches into the I Have a Dream section, which starts after his written remarks are done, and he's basically just improvising after Mahalia Jackson says, "Tell him about the dream, Martin." So the dream was actually not written down. He just goes off. So this is why the bounce check speech became the I Have a Dream speech, because it's so much easier to talk about a dream than the check bounced. Yeah.
There was I was watching a documentary about Byron.
Byron, Brother Outsider?
Oh, no. Byron Rustin?
Byron Rustin, right?
Yeah. They were showing a video of recording of him giving the I Have a Dream speech. You have him in the background right there, lipping everything that he was saying.
Yeah.
So it wasn't written, but it was written. Was it not?
I'm sure he practiced it. Right, especially the bounce checks part. Right.
Because they were talking about how he helped write a lot of his speeches and stuff like that. And like I said, we have that image of Martin Luther King up there telling his speech, and right there on the side, Bird, verbatim everything he was saying.
Sure.
It's crazy.
Yeah. Was that in Brother Outsider?
I don't remember what it was on.
There's a documentary of Bob Byard that's called Brother Outsider.
Yeah, it was, because it was on a cable channel. Logo.
Yeah.
And so yeah.
Logo. Right. So yeah. So before and after the march. So the March on Washington is not just for it's for the similar issues as the one that nearly happened in the war years. Basically, it's about justice and equality, especially justice in hiring. Affirmative action actually originated in the 30s during the Depression, but most people basically take it as referring to a speech that Kennedy made during his presidency. So from a speech given by him exhorting companies to take affirmative action, and they also had a presidential executive order. After Kennedy's death, his vice president and then succeeding president Johnson signed into law Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Okay, so this is in the King days from Selma from the 50s, Bloody Sunday. The Voting Rights Act had been passed again, and there was one passed a century before in 1865, but it wasn't enforced in the South. So Martin and Coretta leading the march in Montgomery. Selma to Montgomery March for Voting Rights ended 3 weeks and 3 events that represented political and emotional peak of the modern civil rights movement. Bloody Sunday and March 7th in 65, 600 civil rights marchers headed out of Selma on US Route 80. They got only as far as the Edmund Pettus Bridge, 6 blocks away, where state and local lawmen attacked them with billy clubs, tear gas, and drove them back into Selma. 2 days later, Martin led a symbolic march to the bridge. Then, civil rights leaders sought court protection for a 3rd full-scale march from Selma to the state capital of Montgomery. Federal court judge weighed the right of mobility against the right to march and ruled in favor of the demonstrators. The law is clear that the right to petition one's government for the redress of grievances may be exercised in large groups, and these rights may be exercised by marching even along public highways, because they were met by law enforcement, right? So you have to have the court to overrule them. The Edmund Pettus Bridge, mounted troopers confronted the marchers and ordered them to disperse. The marchers stood their ground, the troopers advanced, billy clubs raised. John Lewis, who's now a congressman, fell, his skull fractured. Others fell, screaming as white onlookers cheered. Then Sheriff Jim Clark's deputized posse charged the marchers, firing tear gas, swinging bullwhips, and rubber tubing wrapped in barbed wire. Yeah, huge. That night, ABC interrupted its showing of the movie Judgment at Nuremberg to air footage of Bloody Sunday. By morning, news of the event had spread to nearly every American household, and thousands of march supporters began to flock to Selma. So, 3,200 marchers set out from Montgomery, walking 12 miles a day, sleeping in fields. By the time they reached the capital on March 25th, there were 25,000 of them. Less than 5 months after the last of the 3 marches, Lyndon Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act of '65. So, affirmative action. In '61, President Kennedy issued an executive order declaring that contractors who work with the federal government should take affirmative action to ensure fair treatment of employees and job applicants regardless of their race, religion, color, or national origin. Subsequently, federal and state governments have developed affirmative action programs to increase employment and educational opportunities for minorities and to compensate for past discrimination. And now affirmative action covers you also if you are disabled, a veteran, and over 40. So eventually affirmative action will cover everybody if you live long enough. Okay? Originally, as conceived in the 30s, affirmative action policies used in the United States to increase opportunities for minorities by favoring them in hiring and promotion, college admissions, and awarding of government contracts. Depending on the situation, minorities might include any underrepresented group, especially one defined by race, ethnicity, or gender. So if I haven't explained this yet, generally, affirmative action has been undertaken by government, businesses, or educational institutions to remedy the effects of past discrimination against a group, whether by a specific entity such as a corporation or by society as a whole. So let's see, where do I go? Right, so historically, until the 60s, legal barriers is legal to discriminate, so legal barriers prevented blacks and other racial minorities in the United States from entering many jobs and educational institutions. Although women were rarely legally barred from jobs or education, many universities would not admit them and many employers would not hire them. Therefore, affirmative action protected so-called protected classes. Well, let me show you how this works. Would you like to see? Affirmative action is a shibboleth. So many people think that affirmative action, so what are some of the things you've heard about affirmative action? There's shibboleth. Okay, affirmative action is, have you heard quotas? Okay, so that's a shibboleth. Quotas. What else? Unqualified people, right? Okay, so unqualified people getting quotas, getting preferences, et cetera, right? So, very few people actually see the actual law and how it works in practice. All right? So, let's take where we are. LCC. All right? I always have fun with this. LCC is a... So, first what affirmative action asks you to do list your job categories and number of people employed. That is your workforce. And do a workforce analysis. All right? So this goes with the Euro-American epistemology of counting and measuring. Right? How do we know something's real? We count them. Now, there is a thing called the 80% rule, which basically says 20% don't identify. Okay, because affirmative action is to remedy past discrimination that might not be passed. So how do you tell? Okay, so you define not only your categories, but your local hiring area. Okay, so where do you think LCC's local hiring area is?
University of Oregon.
University of Oregon? Okay.
West Coast.
West Coast? Well, that depends on the job category. Because it's interesting, depends on, when you said University of Oregon, there are some departments that only will consider people from the University of Oregon, which in fact is illegal. But, okay, you have to have a compelling business interest to only hire people from the University of Oregon, which we don't, okay? So we're a college and university. And colleges and university, and so for example, it was a black president at LCC that made the following rule. For all hires of faculty, managers, and administrators, including the president, we will hire from a national pool. Okay, so for faculty, managers, and administrators, like the president, the local hiring area is the United States. With the internet, it's the planet. Okay? For classified, okay, office workers, custodians, etc., Northwest. So not national, but Northwest. And we'll also do some targeted stuff for vice presidents and things like that. All right? So it depends. All right? So not the University of Oregon, but there are some departments that, oh, we really like part-timers from the University of Oregon. We don't, even though we could look nationally. All right? So not everybody checks the box. So when you apply for a job, you could optionally check the box, but about 20% people don't identify. Some do, some don't. Right? So let's say, let's take my hire in 1992. So there were 44 faculty positions from retirement. And and there were, let's see, 1,400 applications for those 44 positions, and about 160 of them were minority. About 11%. Which you may note is higher than the minority population in Oregon. Now, for certain faculty positions, African Americans make up of all faculty about 10 to 11% of all college professors. African Americans make that up. For certain language groups, like 30% of language teachers, foreign language teachers are native speakers. So that means for like Spanish on the West Coast, yeah, it's possible to find a third Latino, Hispanic, Spanish teachers. Not unusual, right? So minorities are represented. And here's what was happening with this particular faculty pool. Yeah, 11%, 11% of the applicants were minority. Now, if there were no barriers, so affirmative action allows you to do one of two things. Analyze your workforce. How does it look nationally for your local hiring area? So for LCC, for faculty and above, because we do have a hierarchy here, notice that. It's a hierarchical organization, right? So for faculty above, it's a national pool. So you don't go by what the racial makeup is of Eugene. You go by the racial makeup of the nation, of colleges and universities in the United States, because people move around all the time, right? Reasonable? Understand how that works? So it's not reflective of how many minorities you got in Eugene or in Oregon. That's irrelevant. Local hiring area is the nation, because you are a college and university, not a small-time business in Marcola. Right? It's really important to get that distinction. All right, so let's say at one point there were 250 faculty. And at the time of my hire, there was one African American. So you do the math on that. How is it only one African American when 10% of African Americans make up all college professors? So if LCC was basically within the 80% rule, that is 80% of your local hiring area, that would mean that they would need, another 19 black college professors to achieve parity. This is where the quota part comes in. It's not a quota, it's a goal. How does your workforce compare to your local hiring area? Is it the same? If it's not the same, discrimination is happening. If it is the same, and you're allowed to be within 80%, okay, then you can take affirmative action to get closer, get your numbers closer. Now, here's how you do it. They have to be qualified. Okay, so if you have one white male who's qualified and a tie between a protected class person, that's for affirmative action, okay, so a woman, a white woman, or an ethnic minority, for which you have demonstrated, we're kind of low. We could actually, so it has to actually be a tie. They actually have to be equally qualified. If the minority is less qualified, you can't use affirmative action. That's illegal. If the white male is actually less qualified, you can't hire them because they're your cousin. That's illegal. Okay? The only time affirmative action comes into play is if you have a tie between a white man and a woman in minority, then and only then, and you're underutilized for that particular category or group. If you are underutilized, then and only then can you use affirmative action to break the tie. White man's more qualified, affirmative action doesn't apply. Tie between minorities or a woman, affirmative action doesn't apply. Affirmative action only applies in a tie between equally qualified candidates where one is a protected class for which you're underutilized. Period. Now, when you look at the courts to see, okay, how many times has a minority been hired over a more qualified white man? According to the courts, 3% of the time. So, what's all the big deal? So here's what happened in my hire. Right? There was one African American out of 250 faculty. Way underutilized, right? Because if LCC had achieved parity, there'd be like 25 black faculty. In the 20 years that I've been here, there have never been more than 7, ever. 4 now. Okay, out of total positive. So here's what happened. 44 faculty positions, 160 minorities. How many would you expect to, if LCC was transparent, how many would you expect to get hired in that hiring if they were all qualified? Simple math problem. 4, right? They hired me. Now, is it possible that out of 159 other minorities in that pool that I'm the only one that's qualified? It's possible. I mean, I'm good, but not that good. All right? So, the feds require you to do the math. All right? This result, one African American hire out of 114,000 apps or 160 minorities is 3 standard deviations from chance. The federal standard for detecting discrimination is 2. So the numbers are saying there's discrimination going on. They seem to be applying, but they're not getting hired. While otherwise qualified. And that's why this becomes such a battleground. Even if you're qualified, there's barriers. Right? So that Civil Rights Act, both Affirmative Action and Civil Rights Act, which prohibits discrimination in public accommodations, was the first modern federal legislation to address those barriers. So Affirmative Action, Civil Rights Bills, and Voting Rights Act. All right? So Title VII, the Civil Rights Act, specifically banned discrimination in employment, led to the groundwork for development of affirmative action in hiring. Equal Opportunity Commission created the Civil Rights Act of '64, and the Office of Federal Contract Compliance became important enforcement agencies for affirmative action. So let's end here, because this will take way more explained. The rolling music. See you Wednesday.